the most famous monster on Earth started as a government document. Not a legend traded around the fire, a report, filed by a military administrator who was supposed to be running a border district about a body that turned out to be doing exactly what bodies do after a couple of months underground. Forget the cape, forget the castle on the cliff, the slicked accent, the Transylvanian fog rolling in a queue. Every piece of that image is younger than the United States. The vampire that people genuinely believed in, the one that convinced sober adults to dig up their own dead and put stakes through them, was not a seductive nobleman. It was a bureaucratic emergency in a war zone. Here's where it actually begins. A village called Kisilova in what is now Serbia in the summer of 1725. 9 people dead in 8 days. A Habsburg official named Ernst Frombald gets sent to find out what is killing them, and he winds up standing over an open grave, looking down at a man who had been in the ground for somewhere between 8 and 10 weeks. The nose was about to fall off. That was the only part that looked right. The rest of the body had not decayed the way a 2-month corpse should, and there was fresh blood in the mouth. That blood is the whole story. What Frombald wrote down was true. He was a careful man describing what sat in front of him. He simply had no way of knowing that every single thing he found was normal. The history of the vampire is the history of people looking at an ordinary dead body, seeing a monster, and reacting accordingly. The tuxedo came much later. The dead man was Petar Blagojevic. German clerks turned his name into Peter Plogojowitz, and that spelling is the one that survived. He had died, and then over the following week his neighbors started dying too, fast, and several of them said on their deathbeds that Plogojowitz had come to them in the night and laid on top of them, pressing the breath out of them. The village wanted him dug up. Frombald, who answered to Vienna and not the village, went along to supervise, partly because he could not have stopped them and partly because somebody official needed to write it down. His report ran in the Wiener Schießes Diarium, a Vienna newspaper, on the 21st of July 1725. It is the first time a Habsburg official put his name to a vampire investigation on paper. He describes the body as completely fresh apart from the falling nose. He notes the blood at the mouth, he records that the villagers staked the corpse and burned it, and that he stood there while they did it. A government employee filing what amounts to an expense report, watching a man get burned for the crime of not rotting on schedule. Now, why Serbia? This matters because the place everyone associates with vampires had nothing to do with any of it. In 1718, the Peace of Passarowitz handed Austria a chunk of Serbian territory that had been under Ottoman control. For the first time, administrators trained in the habits of the Enlightenment, men who believed in reports and procedures and reason, were posted into villages where digging up a suspicious corpse and killing it a second time was an old Orthodox Slavic custom. Generations old. The custom was not new. The men taking notes on it were. That collision between a paper-driven empire and a folk practice it had never seen up close is the entire reason we have these documents at all. The city of Vienna's own historians put the heart of the panic not in Transylvania, but in present-day Serbia and the empire's southeastern frontier. Transylvania enters this story in 1897. That is Bram Stoker, and we will get to him. The folk vampire, the one in the ground at Kisilova, never set foot there. 7 years after Plogojowitz, the Empire produced its masterpiece of the genre, and I mean that as a compliment to the document, not the content. In the village of Medvedja, a soldier named Arnold Paole had died years earlier in an ordinary way, falling off of a hay wagon. After his death, people in the area began dying and the old fear came back. This time the response was not one civil servant tagging along. In the 12th of December 1731, Emperor Charles VI personally ordered an investigation. A team of medical and military officers went in. On the 26th of January 1732, in Belgrade, they signed a report titled Visum et Repertum, which is Latin for seen and discovered. The chief author was a regimental field surgeon named Johann Fluckinger. Two other medical officers, Siegel and Baumgartner, co-signed. Two officers, Bottener and von Lindenfels, witnessed it. The original still sits in the Austrian State Archives. The report covers 17 deaths in the outbreak and describes 13 bodies that were dug up and examined one by one. Here's what makes it the document instead of just a document. It does not say they were all vampires. It says some of the corpses were fresh, blood at the eyes and nose and mouth and ears, the shirt and the coffin soaked through, the old nails and skin sawed off the hands and feet with what looked like a new growth underneath. And it says in the same flat administrative voice that others in the same graveyard were completely decomposed. Ordinary, falling apart in the way that you would hope a dead person falls apart. That detail is the one nobody at the time knew what to do with, and it is the one that quietly demolishes the supernatural reading. If the dead come back, they should all come back the same. They did not. Some bodies looked alive and some looked like soup, in the same ground, in the same season, and the man with the pants treated the difference as proof of vampirism when it was a proof of soil chemistry. When they drove a stake into the fresh-looking one, the report says it groaned out loud and bled heavily. Then they burned it to ash and threw the ash back into the grave. The groan, more than anything, is what sold it. A dead thing making a noise when you stab it. Try explaining to a frightened village in 1732 that you have simply squeezed a balloon. Because that is what happened. Every sign in that report has a plain physical cause, and this is the part of the whole story I find genuinely worth slowing down for. Start with the blood. A body does not just dry up. After death, the blood breaks down, the red cells rupture, and the putrefaction inside the gut starts generating gas. That gas builds pressure, and the pressure has to go somewhere, so it forces a dark red fluid out through whatever openings are available: eyes, nose, mouth, ears. Forensic people call it the purge fluid. To a soldier in 1732 who expects a real corpse to be dry and brown and mostly gone, finding a face wet with red liquid is the single most alarming thing he will see that year. It reads as fresh blood. It is not fresh. It is the body emptying itself under pressure, and the red is just old blood that has separated and then reliquefied into something that looks horribly alive. The lack of decay is the same trick from a different angle. Bodies do not rot on a fixed timetable. The speed depends on the soil, the temperature, how deep the grave is, how much fat the person carried, what killed them, even which bacteria were already living in their gut. A body in cold alkaline clay can stay recognizable for a startlingly long time, while a body 20 feet away in warm sand turns out to almost nothing. The investigators had no concept of this. To them, not rotting meant not properly dead. The actual science of how a body breaks down, taphonomy, did not exist as a field of study until the 20th century. These men were running a murder inquiry 150 years before anyone invented forensics. The nails and the skin are my favorite because they are the most convincing and the most wrong. As a body decomposes, the outer layer of the skin loosens and detaches from the layer beneath, and it comes away in sheets. When that outer skin peels off the fingertips, the nail can slide off with it, and what gets exposed is the nail bed underneath, the pink and slightly raised and clearly outlined. To anyone watching, that looks exactly like a fresh nail going in to replace the old one. Hair seems longer for a related reason, because the skin retracts and dries and pulls back from the root. The body looks like it's still living, still tending to itself. It is doing the opposite. It is coming apart, and the coming apart is what manufactures the illusion of growth and the groan. When you punch a stake through a chest cavity full of putrefaction gas, you compress the chest, and that gas gets forced up and out through the voice box on its way to open air. The larynx does what a larynx does when air presses through it, and it makes a sound low and wet and completely mechanical. Nobody groaned. A corpse exhaled because a man stood on it. There is one more of these that almost never gets mentioned, and it is the grimmest of a lot. Gravediggers across Europe occasionally opened the coffin of a pregnant woman and found a delivered infant beside her, and you can imagine what that did to a village. It is real, it is documented in the medical literature as far as back as the 16th century, and it has a cause as mundane as all the others. The same putrefaction gas that pushes blood out of the mouth builds up in the abdomen and can force a fetus out of the body after death. Horrifying to find. Completely physical. None of these officers were stupid. That is the thing to hold on to. They were good observers with no model to make the sense of what they saw, which is a worse spot to be in the plain ignorance, because it means everything you see is real and every conclusion you draw from it is wrong. There is a deeper reason the belief held on for centuries, and it is not gullibility. The vampire was a working theory of contagion before anyone understood contagion. Look again at Kisilova. One man dies, then 9 of his neighbors die in 8 days, and the survivors say he came to them in the dark and drained them. Strip out the dread, and that is a description of a household epidemic spreading from a first case outward. The disease that fits the best, the one that shadows every European and later American vampire scare, is tuberculosis. Consumption, they called it. It moves through families because families share air and beds and walls. It works slowly, hollowing a person out over months until they are thin and pale and grey, visibly drained of something. It makes you cough blood, so there is blood at the mouth in life, and after that, from it the lungs and mouth can hold red liquid longer than you would expect. That is the family cluster sitting behind every one of these cases. Plogojowitz 9, Paul's dead at Medvedja, not one corpse climbing out to murder a village. One infection moving through people who lived on top of each other, explained with the only model anyone had. Here is what convinces me the belief was never simple foolishness. Nearly every culture on Earth invented a version of its own, with no contact between them, which means they were all reacting to the same raw material. A dead body, the way it changes in the ground, and the way sickness moved through the people standing around the grave. All of it observed honestly and explained with no science to explain it. The Mesopotamians had the Edimu, spirits of people who were buried improperly, who wandered back and fed on the living, and the cure was correct burial. 4,000 years ago, and the logic is already the logic of Kisilova. Greece kept a whole bestiary of them. The Ampusa, a blood-drinking demigoddess, the Lamia, who seduced men and devoured children, the Strix, an owl creature set to feed on infants, which Romans took seriously enough that it surfaces in their actual legal language in the Lex Cornelia. Then it gets stranger and better. In India, the Vitala is a corpse-dwelling spirit tied to cremation grounds, and you meet in the cycle of stories called the Batal Pashisi. the 25 Tales of the Vetala. But the Vetala is a riddler and a philosopher more interested in trapping you in a moral puzzle than in your blood. The Chinese Jiangshi, the stiff corpse, comes straight out of rigor mortis. It cannot bend, so it travels in hops, arms locked out in front, and it drains not blood but quite the life force. People believed a corpse could become one if a cat jumped over it. And the thing that wards off Jiangshi is a garlic, which is the detail that should make you sit up, because half a world away with no possible contact, Europe landed on garlic too. Two civilizations separately decided the same kitchen plant holds off the dead. Either there is something to it, or human beings are extremely predictable, and I know which way I lean. I will move quickly through the rest because the pattern is the point and the catalog is not. West Africa has the Adze, a firefly that turns into a blood drinker once you catch it. Southern Africa has the Impundulu, a lightning bird that spreads sickness. The Philippines have a swang, which is not a museum piece at all. People still believe in it, and the story was potent enough as a social weapon that it got used as a propaganda against the rebels in the 1950s. The fear of the returning dead is not a quirk in medieval Europe. It is something close to a human constant. The Slavic world, where our paperwork comes from, did not have one vampire. It had a shelf of them. The root word Upir shows up in writing as far back as the 1047 in a Russian manuscript, attached to a man as a nickname, the wicked one, and it most likely came in from a Turkic word for witch. The Greeks had the Virikolakas, and theirs carried a theological sting. If the Orthodox Church excommunicated you, the belief went, the earth would refuse your body, and it would not decay, which flipped an incorrupt course from a sign of sainthood into a sign of damnation. The same uncorrupted body, opposite meaning, depending on whether the church had signed off on you. The Greek clergy was still wrestling with this well into the 18th century. In Romania, the Strigoi handed Hollywood the detail it loved the most, the dead relative who comes home to visit and drains the family. Romanian custom also included a small piece of genius. You put a millet seed or garlic in the coffin because the Strigoi is compelled to count, and counting seeds until sunrise keeps it busy and out of trouble. This is not ancient and gone either. In 2003, in a Romanian village called Marituni de Sas, a family dug up a relative, cut out the heart, burned it, stirred the ashes into water, and drank it to cure sick relations. Police got involved. There had to be an actual conversation about how that is, technically, against the law. The German lands had the Nachzehrer, the afterfeeder, which is the one I find quietly the worst. It does not leave the grave at all. It lies there chewing on its own burial shroud, and as it chews, its living relatives sicken and fade. The defense was to wedge a coin or stone into the mouth before burial, so it could get not started. Strip the magic off and you get the truth underneath. Decomposition slackens the jaw and rots the cloth, and somebody opened the grave, saw a shroud half pulled into a gaping mouth, and built a monster out of it. For a while, the Empire just kept filling reports and letting villages burn their dead. Then the science caught up with the panic, and it caught up in the shape of one stubborn Dutchman. By the 1750s, the vampire stories had spread north into Moravia, and they landed on the desk of Empress Maria Theresa. She did not send a priest, she sent her own personal physician, a Leiden-trained doctor named Gerard von Swieten, born in 1700, the kind of man who trusted dissection over a rumor. Von Swieten sent two physicians, Gasser and Wobst, to do the hands-on work on a specific case, a dead woman named Rosina Polakin, then read their findings and wrote his verdict. His verdict has not aged a day. He said the whole business came from nothing but empty fear, superstitious credulity, dark and overheated imagination, and plain ignorance. He explained the preserved bodies through fermentation and a lack of air in the grave, which is not quite right, but is reaching hard for a physical cause instead of a demonic one. It was the Enlightenment looking for a vampire in the face and refusing to flinch. Maria Theresa read it and acted. On the 1st of March 1755, she issued an imperial decree that pulled the response to vampires out of villagers' hands and handed it to the state. Digging up a body in the name of fighting vampires became a punishable offense. Staking, beheading, and burning the dead were banned outright. Reports of vampirism were placed under censorship, treated as a matter for doctors and administrators rather than terrified neighbors. An empress had, in effect, made vampires illegal. Roughly 9 years before that, a French monk named Dom Augustin Calmet had already taken the subject apart in print in a long treatise to apparitions that approached the whole panic as a problem to be reasoned through rather than a horror to be feared. The intellectual demolition was finished. The vampire, as a belief held by serious institutions, was done. Except it was not, because the vampire was about to be reborn somewhere the Enlightenment had no authority at all. Fiction. Before we get to the novels, one detour west, because the smug version of this story claims vampire panic was a peasant problem that civilized Europe outgrew. It was not. It was happening on American farms inside living memory. From roughly 1780 to 1892, rural New England, Rhode Island, and Connecticut, and Vermont and Maine did exactly what Kisilova did. Families whose members were dying of consumption, one after another, dug up their dead, opened them, and looked for a heart that still held blood. When they found one, they burned it, and sometimes they mixed the ashes into water and fed the drink to the sick survivors as a cure. Frederick Ransom dug up in Vermont in 1817. The Ray family in Connecticut in 1854. A man in Rhode Island named Tillinghast who was said to have lost 7 of his own children to the thing. The one that everybody remembers is Mercy Brown. Exeter, Rhode Island, January 1892. Mercy Brown went into newspapers around the world. 5 years later, a theatre manager in London published a novel about an undead count, and his research notes show he kept clippings about exactly this kind of thing. The folk vampire and the fictional one shook hands in 1892 in a graveyard in Rhode Island, and most people have never even heard her name. So how did we get from a soaked shroud and a stake to a man in evening wear? It happened in stages, and it began of all places at a rented villa on Lake Geneva in 1816. Lord Byron, the Shelleys, and Byron's personal doctor, John Polidori, were trapped inside through a miserable wet summer and held a contest to see who could write the best ghost story. That weekend produced Frankenstein. It also produced from Polidori a story called The Vampire, published in 1819, and that story is where the monster puts on its first good suit. Polidori's villain is Lord Ruthven. He is an aristocrat. He moves through London society, attends the right parties, charms the right woman, and he is deadly to them in a way that is plainly about seduction rather than disease. He was openly modeled on Byron, who was both flattered and annoyed. The story tore across Europe, translated into French and German and Italian within a year, and feeding stage adaptations for decades. Everything Hollywood would later sell starts in that one story. Then came the gore years. Varney the Vampire ran from 1847 as a penny dreadful, a vast serialized horror story that stretched past 200 chapters, the kind of thing sold cheap to people who wanted a weekly thrill. Varney gave the vampire fangs that leave 2 neat puncture wounds, which had never been a fixed part of the folklore and is now the first thing a child will draw. He also, between killings, feels sorry for himself, which makes him the first vampire to hate being one. The piece that actually fed Stoker came in 1872. Sheridan Le Fanu wrote Carmilla about a female vampire, and he set it in Styria, which was Habsburg ground, the same empire that had filed the original reports. Carmilla preys on young women with a tenderness that is openly, unmistakably erotic, a quarter century before Dracula, and far more direct about it. Her victims fade and weaken exactly the way consumption's patients fade. Le Fanu knew his Gothic, and Stoker read him closely. Pieces of Carmilla are sitting inside Dracula if you know where to look. Which brings us to the man himself, and to the single biggest thing people get wrong about him. Bram Stoker was not a haunted Transylvanian mystic, he was a theatre manager. For 27 years, he ran the Lyceum Theatre in London for the actor Henry Irving, which is a job about contracts and schedules and managing a difficult star. He spent something like 7 years researching his novel in the reading room of the British Museum, and a good chunk of his working notes still survive in a museum in Philadelphia, so we are not guessing about how he built it. The notes are deflating in the best possible way. He did not start with Transylvania. He picked it up from the single magazine essay Emily Girard's piece on Transylvanian superstitions published in 1885. The name Dracula was a late arrival too. For a long stretch his villain was called Count Vampire, which tells you how close the most famous name in horror came to never existing. He found the name Dracula in a dry diplomatic memoir about Wallachia and Moldavia from 1820, spotted a footnote claiming the word meant devil, and grabbed it. The word actually means something closer to dragon. He ran with the wrong translation because it sounded better. And here's the part that should finally retire one of the most repeated facts about this book. The connection between Dracula and Vlad the Impaler is almost entirely invented after the fact. Stoker did not write his count as a fictional Vlad. He took the name out of a footnote. The whole idea that Dracula is secretly the historical Vlad III was largely constructed and popularized in the 1972 by a book called In Search of Dracula, 3/4 of a century after the novel came out. The real Vlad was a savage ruler by any measure, but he did not drink blood, he was not undead, and no vampire legend was attached to him while he lived. The famous link is a 20th century graft onto an 18th century misreading. What Stoker did do, and this is the one place where I will lean on that kind of phrasing, was assemble the modern rulebook out of spare parts and his own invention. The mountain castle, the Transylvania as the homeland, turning into a bath, which he expanded from a flicker of it in Carmilla, casting no reflection, sleeping in a coffin packed with his native soil, the full kit of steak and garlic and holy water, and the rule that he cannot come in unless invited. Almost none of it comes from the Slavic dead in the ground at Medvedja. Stoker built a coherent, marketable monster, and it buried the real one so thoroughly that we now call it the fake, the original. One more correction because it is the funniest. The idea that sunlight burns a vampire to death on contact is not in a Dracula. Stoker's count walks around London in broad daylight. The sun weakens him and strips his powers, but it does not kill him. The instant death by sunlight rule was invented in 1922 by a German film called Nosferatu, and it was invented for a reason that has nothing to do with folklore. The filmmakers could not get the rights to Dracula, so they changed the names and details to dodge a lawsuit, renamed the Count to Orlok, and handed him a fresh weakness so the film would not read as a straight copy. Orlok dies in the dawn light, Dracula never did. The most iconic vampire rule in the world is a copyright workaround that everyone mistook for ancient law. After that, the monster only got more comfortable. In 1931, Bela Lugosi put on the cape and the formal wear and the slow hypnotic stare for Universal, and because Lugosi was Hungarian and spoke with a real accent, the performance fused with the image and set like concrete. For decades, that was the vampire. Then Anne Rice turned it inside out. Her 1976 novel, Interview with the Vampire, gave us the creature that does not want to be a monster and will talk to you about it for as long as you let him. Lewis and Lestat brood and argue and grieve. The plague-spreading corpse that villages burn became an immortal aesthete, asking what any of it means. Rice wrote it in the shadow of her own daughter's death from leukemia, and you can feel the grief working underneath the fangs. Plenty of readers have also noticed that the vampire boom which followed in the 1980s lines up neatly with the AIDS years, a disease passed through blood carried by an attractive stranger, leaving the person it touched permanently changed. And then a long fall from the grave hit the bottom. By 2005, the vampire of Twilight sparkles in sunlight instead of burning, refuses to kill, and waits patiently to court a teenager. The thing that started as a swollen, leaking corpse that terrified the Serbian village ended as a polite boyfriend. You could not get further from the dead man at Kisilova if you set out to. The vampire that was real was only ever a body in cold ground, behaving exactly as bodies do, watched by men who wrote down the truth and could not read it.